Aloha everyone, and welcome back to People and Nature here at Chaminade University. Today we are going to be discussing rainforest biodiversity and medicine, or as I like to call it, will the bark of an ordinary tree in some remote ecosystem lead to a cure for cancer? And the answer is we truly don't know. We're losing species at a faster rate than we are able to investigate their special chemical properties. Just to backtrack a little bit, most of the pharmacological drugs that we have on the market today came from the natural environment. Over half of our written prescriptions today came from normal plants and animals that had specific toxins or venoms that we were able to manipulate and utilize to be able to treat our diseases. Everything from our antibiotics to our painkillers, etc. A lot of them are biomimics, which means they come from or are very similar to chemical compounds that are found in our natural environment. In fact, over half of the top 10 prescription drugs in the United States come from an origin of either an animal, a plant, or a microorganism, such as a bacteria, yeast, or fungi. And if we look specifically at cancer medications, that number increases. Over 3/4 of anti-cancer drugs come from natural sources. And even to this day, prescription drugs are very effective and our most cost-effective prevention and cure, so treatment of many of our leading diseases. So we rely heavily on these prescription drugs that we have derived from natural sources in our environment. And again, we rely on them heavily. We actually cannot imagine a world without antibiotics, right? Our life expectancy would drop dramatically. Pain relievers, etc. Even something as normal as childbirth would be extraordinarily complicated and far more difficult without things like pain relievers, right? Things that people use every day, like contraceptives or muscle relaxants or blood pressure drugs, etc., anticoagulants for people who might have hemophilia or other sort of blood clotting problems, all take drugs that come from the natural environment originally. But unfortunately, the regions where we get the most of our medicines, because they have the highest biodiversity, are actually in regions that we are currently decimating. So the species loss and biodiversity loss in regions of the world that are remote could mean that we are actually missing out on options for disease treatments, because most of our treatments of disease and relief of suffering comes from tropical rainforests themselves. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that throughout this lecture. For example, we treat hypertension with a chemical that's derived from the venom of the viper fer de lance. And the fer de lance viper is found in Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. And the viper bites are toxic, and the individual who is bitten by the vipers dies due to a severe and rapid drop in blood pressure. And that was something that obviously was bad for the individual, but for the research scientists provided a springboard for working out how that viper venom worked, right? If they could identify the mechanism and maybe the chemical compound in the venom that helps reduce blood pressure, maybe we can tone it down a little bit and target it for people who have hypertension. And hypertension is known as the silent killer. It's chronic blood pressure. And anyway, that led to a treatment for the pathological effects of hypertension. This is a treatment that over 1 billion people worldwide are able to make benefit of or could utilize. And in fact, by 2025, over 1.5 billion people are going to be susceptible to high blood pressure. Currently in the United States, 1/3 of the individuals in the United States have some sort of disease associated with hypertension. And hypertension is very bad for the body if it goes uncontrolled or poorly treated. It can cause all sorts of maladies in the human body, including heart attack, stroke, kidney failure, and several other cardiovascular diseases, as well as dementia and other mental problems and memory losses. So the good news is we were able to isolate a compound in the viper venom and mimic it. It's called captopril. And that's the first member of a novel class of drugs that was used to help reduce hypertension. Basically what it does is it helps basically helps to reduce the blood pressure of people who are subjected to high blood pressure. So it's an inhibitor. And these inhibitors help improve the health and longevity of millions of people currently, and over 1 billion people over the entire world would benefit if they were able to have access to this drug. Another example is of a weapon, basically. It's a tool that we were able to isolate and harvest from the natural environment and then utilize to treat diseases and disorders, comes from the Madagascar periwinkle, which is not the same thing as the periwinkle in the United States. So just to let you know, it's almost an entirely different animal, well, plant, entirely different plant. It's a shrub. It's found in Madagascar and is cultivated all over the tropics and subtropics. Now, the derivative that they were able to isolate from this flower can be used to treat acute lymphocytic leukemia, which is a very severe and often deadly childhood disorder, a childhood cancer known as ALL. And approximately 3,000 children and adolescents are diagnosed in the United States annually, and it used to be a death sentence, so it used to be a fatal diagnosis. But today, over 80% of the cases of this cancer are able to be entirely cured using this drug that comes from the Madagascar periwinkle. So using this drug, we've actually been able to rescue over 100,000 children since its creation and cure them from this ALL, childhood cancer, and save them from an early death. And they do that by a drug called vincristine. Again, it comes from the periwinkle, and it is the first of many in a lines of this drug that they are able to use to treat ALL. So ALL is not the only cancer that vincristine was demonstrated to be utilized to be able to treat, including things like non-Hodgkin lymphomas, rhabdomyosarcomas, neuroblastoma, and Wilms tumor have also been shown to respond to treatments with vincristine. Vincristine is the parental version of a drug called vinblastine, so a derivative of vincristine, which is another anti-tumor agent, and it's actually been shown to work specifically for Hodgkin's diseases, lymphomas, and testicle carcinomas, as well as Kaposi sarcomas, etc. So different cancers require different types of treatment, but this one seems to work on multiple levels because it's able to help impede the cell growth and survival. Now, these are very complex chemical structures, so although we do know what their chemical compounds are, to be able to synthesize them in the laboratory would make them cost prohibitive, so it would make it too expensive for patient use. So actually, the manufacturers rely on cultivating and isolating the chemical compound in Madagascar periwinkle to be able to create these medicinals that are derived from those original compounds. From there, chemists have tweaked the templates a little bit to create two more drugs, vinorelbine, which is used for small cell lung cancer, and vinflunine, which is used in Europe, not yet in the United States, but has been used for treatment of advanced bladder cancer. So these guys are going to be able to help treat multiple different sets of cancers by a whole lineage of drugs that all come from a compound found in the periwinkle plant. So imagine if we had had a event where we had lost all of the periwinkle plant prior to being able to find this, which is possibly the case in many places on the planet where we are destroying the habitat for these organisms without actually delving into their benefit to humanity. However, while medicinal potential is a very compelling reason to protect species biodiversity, there's several other reasons to do so as well. So biodiversity is a global asset that's crucial, so maintaining biodiversity is something we should all be working towards. So we have a diverse collection of plants, animals, and microorganisms on our planet, and within there we have variability, which allows us to provide food for the population, find cures for disease, and increase our economic survival. So by the end of this whole lecture, you should understand the importance of biodiversity as a critical component of ecosystem function, as well as what is a biological hotspot, so regions of intense biodiversity, and how we can protect those critical biological hotspots. All right, so I'm going to start you off with a case study that's ongoing by a professor, Dr. Paul Cox, who moved to Samoa in an attempt to find biomedicinal compounds that were found in plants in this tropical area. So he moved to the Samoan rainforest and was hoping to find a cure for cancer among the plants in this region. And why? Why did he choose Samoa? So Samoa has a huge level of biodiversity, and it's particularly untapped, and what that means is that there's a lot of regions or a lot of plants that have not actually had any sort of research done on their medicinal properties. And so the area where Dr. Cox settled had specifically high ecological biodiversity, and he's currently undergoing research and attempts to try to find plants or medicinal compounds derived from plants or animals that are able to help treat cancers. And so why use tropical regions. So tropical regions have high biodiversity. Again, that's high concentrations and varieties of plants and also animals. Addition to the species diversity and genetic diversity that are seen in the biodiversity in these regions, they also have communities and ecosystems with multiple habitats and several different trophic levels. And what that means is that they have feeding orders, right? So the lower organisms feed the middle organisms, feed the larger organisms, etc. So orders in which the food is flowing through the ecosystem. Tropical regions are very beneficial to all species, not just humans, and that's because they are warm, they're lush, they're close to the equator, so they provide a natural environment that allows species to flourish and allows the greatest biodiversity in these areas like Samoa, right? And biodiversity, again, can be split into multiple components, including the genetic variation, the species variety, and community interaction. So what do I mean by that? So genetic diversity is basically going to be variations in the genetic compound of individuals in the same species. So this is allelic variation, basically, where you might see a bunch of snails that have different colors on their shells, but are still able to selectively mate and interbreed. Now, species diversity means that we have a high variety of species. So genetic diversity is within the same species. Species diversity is within a whole community where we have multiple different species within that area. And there's multiple factors that they take into consideration, including the number of different species that are present, as well as the relative abundance. So what percentage of the overall biomass do each species contribute to the population. And then lastly, we also look at ecological diversity, which includes the non-living environment, like the habitats. It also includes how the living environment interacts with other living environments, with like trophic levels, right? Who eats whom, etc. And community interactions. So how are they competing for shared resources like food and shelter? So there's a great biodiversity. And one of the main things that I wanted to kind of emphasize here is that we don't know what we don't know. So we have estimations of the amount of species in different categories. So for example, things like bacteria versus vertebrates versus mollusks, fungi, and arachnids. So we have known species, which are the amount of species that we have cataloged and are able to say, yes, for sure, these are different from other species. But as you can see, it's much, much, much smaller than the amount that are estimated to exist. All right, so species known for bacteria, approximately 8,000, right? Species estimated, 1,000,000. So my point in showing you this is that we truly do not know the information, that we simply are lacking for many of these different categories of organisms. For example, plants, we do know several. We know most of, much better than something like, say, bacteria or the insects. For plants, we know approximately 310,000 species, and it's estimated that there's approximately 400,000. For insects, however, we only know approximately one out of 9. So there's 1,000,000 species that are known to exist, and over 9,000,000 estimated to exist. My point here is that as we are losing habitats and losing species, we might be losing creatures that we haven't even discovered, which means we certainly haven't had the chance to tap into their bioresources in order to make medicinal compounds that might treat our diseases. And this just kind of underemphasizes or underscores or emphasizes the fact that we have a lot of species that, again, we don't know what all of the species are within that population, and of them we know that we have several of the ones that we know are endangered. And endangered just means that they are facing extinction if the course of events remains untreated, and that means that we have to give them special rights and privileges that are not afforded to other species, like protection of their habitat, etc., in order to help prevent their total loss. And as you can see, most of the species on Earth, over half of the species on Earth, are estimated to be insects in terms of how many we estimate to exist. However, only 4% of them are in our listed species. So our numbers are skewed based on what we've investigated and what we actually do know. And for example, if we look at plants and vertebrates here, both of them have a very high percentage of them that are listed as threatened or endangered. So we know very, very little, and what we do know, we are actually threatening. So imagine what we're threatening in terms of the ones that we don't know. And there's a lot of great factors to biodiversity. Again, it benefits humans in terms of medicinal opportunities and recreation and leisure, etc., but other species as well. So biodiversity provides something called ecosystem service. And what does that mean? That means that between multiple sets of organisms, we are exchanging gases and nutrients and detritus and waste. So it provides oxygen. For example, the plants are off-gassing oxygen and we are breathing in oxygen, off-gassing carbon dioxide, which is what they breathe in, if you will. And we also have waste filtering mechanisms that are provided by our water and our streams and our rivers. And there's a bunch of different sets of cycling that occur between these different ecosystems, or between these different organisms within the ecosystem. And the point there is that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So losing one piece at a time might mean that eventually we are entirely unable to rebuild. So what kind of ecosystem services do they provide? So photosynthesis, for example, we as mammals are unable to create our own energy, but plants are able to do that so they're able to take light energy and store it into chemical energy and chemical bonds in the chemical molecule known as glucose. And then glucose is something that we as animals are able to consume from the plants and then use to be able to break that down to be able to get our own energy. So photosynthesis isn't something that just helps the plant, it helps all of the ecosystem. Right? Another idea of the ecosystem service would be something like nutrient cycling. So an organism that dies, right, dead matter, gets decomposed and then gets brought back up or recycled into the earth, for example, and then tapped into the roots to be able to feed the plants, etc. So the decomposing organisms are there to support the new organism. So old life supports new life. So this is what I mean by the fact that organisms interplay off of one another, not just by feeding one another, although they do that too, but they have an interplay between all of the organisms that's called an ecosystem service. Again, I bring you back to the whole being more than the sum of the parts. Another thing, population control. So competition and predation, basically when organisms are competing with each other or they're consuming one another, that helps maintain the organism balance and promoting diversity as well, because the variability in the population allows for more of them to perhaps survive and reproduce under any sort of ecological challenge. Additionally, something like pollination would count as an ecosystem service when something like an insect or a bird or other mammals are going to spread grasses, herbs, seeds of other organisms like plants from one location to another. So pollination and spread of these plants directly rely on insects, birds, and mammals to be able to take their seeds or to be able to pollinate from one to the next, right? Again, these are all examples of ecosystem services. And we as humans have benefited from ecosystem services for a very long time. But beyond that, natural spaces have other additive human benefits, things like cultural benefits, right? They're aesthetically pleasing and oftentimes have spiritual connections and can be educational in terms of being able to pass information on to the youth. And they are known as recreational or leisurely areas where you might take a kayak or a hike or a bike through those paths. Other things like provisions like food, fiber products like cotton and wool, which we use to create our clothing, fuel, pharmaceutical products, which we just talked about in terms of biomedicine, and last but not least, that regulation and support that we talked about, including nutrient cycling, pollination, purification of your air and water, prevention of flood control, right? The grasses and their roots hold the soils in place. If they didn't, the water would just take the soil right away, and that would cause erosion. Also, soil formation and erosion control. Again, just like I said, those two kind of go hand in hand. Regulation of the climate, and this is very, very important. We'll get to our global warming lecture later on in this semester, but plants are very important as what we call carbon sinks. They basically take the carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in sugars and in their biomass, and that helps take that carbon out of the atmosphere, which helps reduce things like, well, the emissions of the carbon in our atmosphere, which is going to help contribute to the holes in the atmosphere and the increase in global warming. But the more of the carbon we can remove, the better off we are in terms of increasing our global temperatures. And additionally, things like population control, right? When we have predator-prey relationships or competition for food resources, we can keep the number of individuals in any given population in check. So biodiversity is very important, but I'm going to return back to traditional medicinal use because that was my original intention when I was talking about this lecture. And traditional healers know a lot more, or are often the springboard for the pharmaceutical companies, because the traditional healers are the ones that are working closely and intimately with plants that perhaps haven't yet been discovered by the modern society. And they're using plants and insects to treat and cure diseases. And these are information, just like we talked about with the wayfinders, that get passed down from generation to generation and are learned through something like an apprenticeship. So this is going to be more of a traditional learning style whereby the older generation takes their information, which they've accrued from their ancestors and their ancestors before them, and passes that on to their offspring so that those individual lineage will always have the information that have been passed down, again, through apprenticeships. And these here are just two examples of plants that are able to have medicine derived from them. So here's what the Madagascar periwinkle looks like. Here's an example of chloroquine, which is one of many, many different medicines that are derived from the Madagascar periwinkle, including all those ALO and cancer drugs. But chloroquine is used to help treat malaria. And digoxin, several of you might recognize digoxin or have an elderly family member who takes a derivative of digoxin to treat their heart disease. And digoxin comes from a plant which is known as foxglove that often, it's an English garden style plant. Often ladies will have this in their plant gardens, and it's helped many people over the years treating their heart diseases. And oftentimes the reason that pharmaceutical companies become interested in these plants is because they know that native healers use them to make teas. For example, aspirin comes from the bark of the willow tree, and it was long known that you would chew on the bark of the willow tree if you had a toothache or a headache, etc. And then eventually Bayer realized that they could make it and take derivatives of that willow tree and turn it into what we now know today as aspirin. Right? And how do plants and animals derive these chemical compounds? And that's actually kind of an interesting idea of chemical warfare. So basically we have these evolutionary relationships where plants and other animals with other animals and insects, etc., they're all kind of fighting for habitat, they're fighting for resources, and they're also engaging in predator-prey relationships. And that creates chemical weaponry, right? If you can have a chemical compound that makes a predator fall sick if they eat you, or if they are unable to consume it, or if you're able to withstand their digestive measures and then they're able to pass your seeds on, etc. So we have a lot of different chemical compounds, for example, the venom in the viper, that arises to be able to injure and then kill the prey so that it doesn't necessarily get injured itself in the act of predator-prey relationships, right? So these weapons are formed in these organisms, and then we can use them to our advantage for healthcare and the creation of novel drugs. And this is going to continue on with some of the other sets of flowers. You might be familiar with opium, for example. That comes from the poppy flower, and it's derived into morphine and a bunch of other derivatives, which are used as painkillers. Additionally, anyone in here take albuterol for asthma? That actually originally came from a shrub, ephedra, which made a medicinal compound called salbutamol, which then they derived into albuterol. And again, that's used to treat asthma. It helps with opening of the lung passageways if you have constriction. Some other examples, and I'm not going to read all of them, include tuberculin, which is a muscle relaxant, corboxane, which is found in the cobra venom to help relieve pain. Penicillin is really an interesting one too. That actually comes from a fungus, and it was found that in a bacterial culture that this mold kept the bacteria at bay, and so therefore it was found that the fungus actually had an antibacterial component to it, and so now we use penicillin. I mean, I don't know anyone that hasn't taken penicillin in their lifetime, unless of course you're allergic, to be able to treat some sort of bacterial infection. Another one that we use a lot to treat breast cancer, but also lung cancer and ovarian cancers, something called Taxol, which comes from the yew tree. And so, like as I mentioned, there's a bunch of different chemical compounds that are inside these organisms that have helped them to survive and reproduce and flourish in their environments that we can tap into to be able to treat human diseases. And so Western medicine has often taken the natural sources and then upgraded them, right? Replaced them or used them as inspiration for medicines, and then used it as a pharmacology and lab-based chemistry to create and upgrade them to be able to treat specific diseases. However, if you could imagine that we never had access to the yew tree, or we never had access to the Madagascar periwinkle, right, then we might not ever be able to find these cures. And nature still probably holds several secrets that we haven't yet uncovered in regions that we are decimating at too fast of a rate to be able to adequately do the studies before we destroy their habitats. Here's another example of a tree. This is the mamala tree. This is where we get a candidate drug to treat HIV, so it's not yet in clinical trials, but they are working on it. It's called prostratin, and they are actually able to extract it from like the rubber or like the gum of this tree, and then they can use that as a chemical derivative, again, to try to treat HIV. So we constantly have new discoveries that are coming forth on our table, and unfortunately, that's not yet as happening at a quick of a rate as our losses. So although we have new discoveries daily, we're still encountering new losses daily. And this image here is showing botanists trying desperately to protect the very last specimen of a particular plant. This is Delicia undulata that's found in the wild. So while they do have it in their laboratories and in their agricultural gardens, for example, they only have one specimen that's found natively in the world. And they're trying as hard as possible to keep that native habitat from having any other non-native species encroach upon it. And the reason that it's lost the habitat is because livestock farming is a very huge and prevalent industry in the local area, and it's one of the largest factors resulting in loss of habitat, which then results in loss of this species. And again, unfortunately, if we lose these species, we lose whatever chemical warfare that they have spent millions of years creating. Again, they don't just create it overnight. They adapt to other species. There's selective pressure, predator-prey relationships, competition, etc. And that means that if we lose these species, not only do we mourn their loss, but we'll have to mourn the loss of potential templates for life-saving drugs that we haven't had the chance to tap into. So these species cannot go extinct, or we as humankind can suffer as well. So I talked previously about hotspots, regions where we have really high levels of biodiversity. So here's just a couple of them, but there's several of them throughout the planet. Polynesia or Micronesia. In this region, we have endemic plants. So endemic means that they are found nowhere else in the world. So they're not just native. Native means that they are found here originally before something like an invasive species was brought here or landed or moved somehow. But endemic means that they are not only native but are not found anywhere else in the world. That means if we lose this habitat, we will lose 3,074 endemic plants and over almost 100 threatened species, and currently 43 of the species that they had cataloged have gone extinct. So this is a species losses that is happening literally right in front of our eyes. As we are discovering these species, they are facing habitat destruction and they are facing species loss and extinctive events. Another region is the Andes. In the Andes, we have over 15,000 endemic plants. They have high altitude regions that have a specialized habitat that is distinct from almost anywhere else. Almost 500 threatened species and 2 that we know that have gone extinct while we have been paying attention, right? So 2 that have gone extinct on our watch. Another hotspot area is New Guinea. In New Guinea, we have over 1,500, so approximately 1,800 endemic plants, over 100 threatened species, and none that we know of have gone extinct yet. In the Indo-Malayan Archipelago, we have 15,000 endemic plants. Again, that means they're found nowhere else in the world. So if we lose these habitats and these ecosystems, we lose these species. 162 that are threatened and 4 that we know of that, again, have gone extinct on our watch. And why is this important? How do we stop this? One of the things that we need to do is go back to funding plant collection expeditions. So a classic example of a near miss in terms of a loss is an expedition that happened to Borneo in 1987, and they collected a bunch of plants, different samples, and among them were samples from a plant or a tree, Calophyllum Langerum ver austriocoreaceum, which is a species that was incredibly rare. And later on, it was found that they were able to have extracts of this plant that had great antiviral capacity. What that means is that they were able to help decrease the rate of HIV infection and perhaps decrease also transmission. So in individuals that have the HIV, which would be human immunodeficiency virus, which then leads to the syndrome, which is AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, they have a decrease in the progression of the disease. So this was fantastic news, and researchers returned to collect this tree again, but they found that the one tree that was found in Borneo was cut down, and when they asked the locals, it was determined that it was cut down for firewood or for building purposes. They basically just needed it as a resource to utilize, and in that turn, they lost that tree almost entirely. But fortunately, when they did a global search, the Singapore Botanic Garden did have additional samples in the gardens that they had collected over a century ago, a foresight that they had no idea would lead to such medical progression. So my point is, this is an example of a near miss, but how many are still out there that we don't know anything about that are facing habitat destruction and facing extinction? So the product that was found inside the bark of that tree was known as calanolide A, and it's now undergoing clinical trials. So it's gone to the point where it has progressed through several steps of FDA approval and is now in clinical trials for treatment of people with HIV. And this means that research narrowly escaped a huge scientific loss simply because someone wanted to burn that tree for firewood. So we have to be very careful about habitat loss and habitat destruction because unfortunately there's absolutely no way of knowing how many undocumented losses have occurred. So I'm really sorry to leave you on such a negative note, so I'm going to give you just a little bit of an upbeat quote here by Dr. David Cox. Remember that plant physiologist who moved to Samoa to try to find a cure for cancer in some untapped regions that had great biodiversity. And he said, "There is a strong link between the health of forests and the health of humans. If people understand that a rainforest might contain the best cures for diseases that plague us, they will care a whole lot more about saving it." So hopefully that's what I've done to you today. I've helped tap into your sense of caring more about preservation of the rainforest. All right, guys, thank you so very much for sticking with me today. Happy studying, and have a fantastic day.